After I finished painting the exterior in the last episode, I set that aside to cure for a couple of days and in the meantime moved on to the interior. All the parts were prepped with some 400 grit sandpaper before I started priming them and then painting them in various different colors, mostly just green and black. So in the first round of painting I started off with the green. This is a Porsche Speedway green that I had laying around from Zero Paints, and that matched the decals pretty nicely, so I figured that would be a great contrast for on the interior. So most of the parts for the interior that are green will remain matte or get a flat clear coat on top of it, apart from the roll cage, which was clear coated with a gloss clear to make it nice and glossy and look a bit more like a metal part and not have a flat finish like the rest of the interior pieces, which are supposed to look like fabric. After applying all of those paints, I let it sit and cure overnight before I started masking off the seat inserts and could then move on to painting some black for the rest of the parts that are supposed to look like a bit of a leather, or in this case an Alcantara, but I'm simply just applying a flat clear coat on top of it later to give it that final look. For now it will just be a little bit glossy, but that is good for the decals to be applied on top of. A couple parts needs to be unmasked, but I could then start on the ginormous task of applying the super tiny decals. Now most of the decals were so incredibly small that I couldn't really even see them all that clearly on the decal sheet if they were wet, and then getting them to be applied onto the parts was even harder, and then filming it, getting that in focus and showing you actually something being applied was pretty much impossible in most cases for some of the smallest details. Pretty much every single button on the dashboard, on the steering wheel, and on the door panels had a small white decal for the logo that usually lights up, but that is so incredibly small that it couldn't really be captured on camera. Maybe you can see it at the end where I have some still shots of the interior, but for filming purposes it was pretty useless and you just see me moving around my tweezers without much happening. Now luckily there were a lot of other decals as well. Some for on top of the contrasting colors, like you see here is sort of a black mesh, and I decided not to put those on as it made the green a bit too dark and it wasn't really the look that I was after. So after applying it on a couple of parts, checking it over, I decided just to remove those and keep the main green color as a nice bright contrast. On the other hand, there were a lot of small logos, badges, and emblems that needed to be applied as well, along with some screens, etc. And then the most, or one of the most toughest tasks, hardest, voiceover isn't really that easy either. So aside from those small buttons and decals that need to be applied, the hardest decals to be applied were the ones for the contrasting stitching. Now as you see, there are multiple different colors included in the kit for the different exterior stripes. I decided to go for green stripes and green interior bits, so I went with a green stitching as well. Now these are very small and thin decals, kind of fragile and a little bit hard to get in place, and there were quite a few of them, but in the end, after a couple of hours of fiddling around, they were all placed and looked really cool. Now on camera, again, it is a little bit hard to see, but in the end, on the final shots, I hope they come over really nice and clear. Now in the meantime, I have applied some clear coat to the interior bits as well. As you've seen before, I painted it in a jet black, and that was a little bit glossy, so I went over it with a flat clear coat to tone it down, make it look more like interior bits, and then let that cure overnight before I moved on to the next task. So as you noticed, I applied the decals and then applied the flat clear coat, so the decals are now in a flat finish too, and that isn't really what I wanted. Now for some of the interior stitching bits, that was totally fine, but for the instruments and the carbon fiber and some other details, that wasn't really the look I was after, and it toned everything down a little bit too much. So I mixed up some 2K clear and took out a brush and started applying it on the surfaces that I wanted to have a nice high gloss finish. Now usually the 2K clear is sprayed on with an airbrush, and if I would do that with an airbrush, I would need to mask off a ton of parts, and that is a lot of masking and a lot of very complicated masking. Since I didn't really want to spend many hours masking it off and then having a mediocre result due to some incompetent masking, I figured using a brush is a lot quicker and will give pretty much 95% of the same finish that I'm after. In this case, for an interior, that is good enough. The parts just need to be glossy, as they can't really be seen up close anyway, and with a brush and some 2K clear you can achieve quite a nice finish as long as you have a lot of clear on there and apply it in a nice thick coat. Most of the brush strokes on these smaller parts are not even there. On some of the bigger pieces they are, but I can live with that, as the back of the seat and the carbon fiber areas there are mainly the biggest areas that needed the clear coat to be applied to it, and those will pretty much all be hidden behind the roll cage and the roof and the other interior and exterior bits. So it just gives a nice bit of a glossy shimmer, but since it can't be shown up close anyway, it is a really good enough and clean finish and good enough for me. So that way I can justify it, if you kind of get my flow. And if not, well, I don't know, it looks pretty good to me, specifically on those smaller areas, and gives a really nice and completed finished look to the most of the interior parts, and just lifts it up a bit and not has it all in a flat, toned down matte clear coat. To finish off this rant, I do want to add that this can be a little bit of a risky move, applying it with a brush, as the clear coat can be a little bit hot and therefore melt the paints underneath, or specifically the decals. Now, since I did already apply a clear coat on top of the decals, they are a bit more protected and less prone to being ruined by the clear coat being applied with a brush. But don't stay on parts too much. If you apply the clear, just leave it, don't touch it, and move on to the next area, as otherwise it could push and pull the decals or the paint underneath and get a really weird finish. So just go over it once and just leave it. In the meantime, I've started assembling the interior bits, and with this seat in place, that's pretty much it for the assembly on this part. Now, the rest of the interior bits, like the dashboard, the door panels, and some other interior panels, need to be glued into the actual body when finishing off the final assembly. I just stuck them on with some tape to give you an interior overview with the tub completely finished, but these side panels are not glued on. As you can see, they are just in place with some tape.